Hi, welcome to a presentation by the Dreamweavers. The Dreamweavers are a storytelling troupe with the Clermont County Public Library. We have been telling stories for over 27 years, and today we'd like to share some Valentine's stories with you. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the Dreamweavers.
Once, long ago, the great King Arthur was out hunting when he became separated from his companions. In his search to find them, he spied a beautiful white stag. Now this is a rare creature, and he knew that if he could bag it, it would make a fine trophy. So he began to pursue it deeper into the woods the stag led him, until it stopped and turned to face him. And as it turned, it transformed into a knight. The knight was fully clad in armor, and he had his weapons drawn, and with one swift blow, he dismounted King Arthur. "Prepare to die," he said. And King Arthur replied, "I am not afraid to die. But you dishonor yourself. You are fully clad in your armor, and I am dressed only in hunter's clothing. Allow me to return and get my armor, and I will come back and I will fight you." The knight looked at him. He said, "I will spare you under one condition. You return in 1 year with the answer to this question: what do women desire most?" Arthur agreed. He rode back to his castle, and he told his court all about the adventure and the quest he was now set upon. The castle grew silent. Then one voice spoke up, and it was Sir Gawain, and he said, "My liege, I cannot let you ride this alone. I will go with you and ride with you to do this." Pleased, King Arthur and Sir Gawain set off out on the quest. They rode across the country and talked to a multitude of women, asking them, what do women desire most? They had a varied multitude of answers. Some wanted silver and gold and diamonds and wealth upon wealth. Others wanted silks and satins and dresses of fine materials. Some had another take and said they just wanted passionate love. Well, the year rolled on. All the answers, from simple to complex, had been compiled into a long list, and the men were returning to speak to the knight to give him those answers, hoping one of them was the right one. As they rode, though, they heard a voice yelling at them, "My lords, my lords!" The two men stopped and looked, and what they beheld was unsightly. It was a lady. At least they thought it was. She was so ugly. Her hair was thin and matted on one side and wild on the other. Her eyes more piggish than person, and her one tooth, was as yellow as mustard. Her rags were so filthy they could have stood on their own, and the only thing that stank more than them was, her breath. The men asked her, "What would you have of us, my lady?" She said, "Oh, you're on a quest, I hear." "Indeed we are. How could you know?" "I know a lot of things," she replied. "Then what is the quest we're on?" "You seek to know what women desire most." "I know the answer to that question, and I'll give it to you, but under one condition." "What is that, my lady?" asked the king. "You must have one of your knights marry me." Well, this was unexpected. The king sat there in silence for a moment, until Sir Gawain looked at King Arthur and said, "I will marry this lady. For if she has the answer, it will save your life. And if we don't, then you will die." King Arthur looked at him. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes, my lord." And so they agreed. She was overjoyed. That loathsome lady looked at Sir Gawain and said, "Wow, you're a pretty man." Sir Gawain said, "Thank you." And she motioned him down, and she whispered the answer into his ear. They rode off until they came to that knight, and he was standing there, and he says, "Well, do you have the answer?" They gave him the long list that they had compiled. He read every answer on there, and then he rolled it up, threw it down, and said, There's no truth to any of these. These are not the answers I was looking for. These are all wrong. So prepare to die, King Arthur. And Sir Gawain spoke up and said, but wait, I have one more answer. And he gave the answer to the question. What do women desire most? Their own way. Angry that night. Oh, how could you have gotten it? There's only one person you could have gotten it from. And he cursed and disappeared. Sir Gawain and King Arthur rode back to the Lonesome Lady, took her on the horse, went back to the castle, and in a very solemn and somewhat sad wedding ceremony, they were married. Some people were very kind to her. Most avoided her on their stench alone. And then it was that night, the wedding night. They were in the chambers. She, this terrible-looking creature, and the handsome young Sir Gawain, as he paced back and forth in the chambers, wondering what he should do. He couldn't bear to bring himself near her. When she spoke and said, well, husband, come near and give me a kiss, and let's make this wedding official. He agreed. He leaned in, closed his eyes, and he kissed her. When he opened his eyes again, the Lonesome Lady was gone. A woman, beautiful by all measures and desirable in every way, was sitting there, and she said, you have done it. You have broke the first half of the spell. And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, you have a choice now. You can either have me as this beautiful woman whenever we're in the company of others for half the day, or you can have me as the Lonesome Lady whenever we're in the company of others for half the day, and I will be this beautiful woman at night when we're alone. Sir Gawain thought, and then he looked at her and he said, my lady, I will leave this choice to you. What would you have me do? And she said, oh, that's the right answer again. And you have completely broken the spell. I will now remain as this beautiful woman for the rest of our lives. And she did. And they had a wonderful, passionate, loving marriage until they were old and passed away. And that's the story of Sir Gawain and the Lonesome Lady.
Once, long ago, in a small village in Poland, there lived a small orphan girl. Her name was Rysel. She was being raised by her grandfather, who she called Zaida. Now, Zaida was a scholar who studied day and night. And because of his wisdom, the people of the village would often seek him out for guidance and advice. And they would pay him with whatever they had: cheese, a loaf of bread, some wood for their fire. And this is how Zaida and Rysel got by. One day, after watching Zaida study and pore over the ancient manuscripts all day long, Rysel asked him, Zaida, why do you study all the time? Zaida said, why study? And with a glisten in his eye, he said to her, it is written that learning is more precious than rubies, more lasting than gold. Rubies may be stolen, gold may be lost, but that which you learn is yours forever. Rysel said, oh, Zaida, I wish to learn. And that very day, they began to read and discuss the old manuscripts, sometimes many hours into the late evening. Then a horrible winter arrived. Zaida became ill. And one evening, as Rysel was reading to him, he breathed his last. The villagers offered words of comfort, and they brought to Rysel what they could spare, but Rysel did not want to be a burden on anyone. And one day, she put on her ragged shawl, she left her home, and walked through the path, through the forest, to the gates of the village. And there she wandered up and down the streets, knocking on doors, asking if there was work that she could be doing. But she was turned away door after door. Just beyond the synagogue, there was a house. She knocked on the door. A very dour-faced woman answered and said, "The poorhouse is down the street." Reisel said, "Oh, please, I'm very capable of working very hard if I could just have a place to sleep." The woman said, "This is the fine house of the great rabbi, and I am his housekeeper and the best cook in Poland. I do not need your help." But just then, the rabbi appeared behind the woman. And again, Reisel said, "Oh, please, I'm very capable of work. I will work hard if I could just have a place to sleep and a little bite of food." And the rabbi said, "Surely you could use some help." The woman very grudgingly led her down to the kitchen. And the woman said to her, "I do not appreciate you trying to push your way into this household and steal my job." She pointed to a washtub and said, "Fill this washtub quickly." And Reisel went back and forth from the kitchen to the well and filled the washtub. And the woman kicked the washtub over and said, "Not fast enough. Fill it again." And Reisel filled it again. She fell asleep so exhausted that night and was roughly shaken awake the next morning by the housekeeper. The housekeeper told her to scrub the stove until it sparkled. And that was how Reisel lived. Day after day, she held her tongue, she hid her tears, and she did as she was told. As Purim drew closer, there was much to do in the household. Costumes to make, feasts to prepare, and one day Reisel was struggling across the courtyard with an armful of wood when suddenly someone bumped into her and she dropped the wood. It fell to the ground and she bent to pick it up, and then she heard a very kind voice say, "I'm so sorry, I should know better than to read and walk at the same time." And she looked up into the sweetest face. It was the rabbi's son. He knelt and helped her pick up the wood and helped her to carry it to the kitchen. And then he began reading again and walked away. The housekeeper said, "I noticed you speaking sweetly to the rabbi's son. You need to mind your own business if you know what's good for her." The next day, a dinner was held, a feast, a Purim feast, and guests arrived dressed in their costumes, and they sat down to a delicious feast of beet soup, roasted duck, potato cakes, and noodle pudding. Reisel was helping to serve and clear the dishes, and she noticed that people were asking the rabbi's son riddles, for he was known for his wisdom. One woman said, "What has a face but no mouth?" And the rabbi's son said, "A clock." Well, Reisel wanted to hear more riddles, and she lingered, and he looked up at her and smiled and said, "Do you have a riddle for me?" But the housekeeper pushed her out of the room and said, "I told you, mind your own business or I will lock you in the pantry." Later that evening, the guests left to go to the Purim ball. And Reisel said, "Oh, I wish I could go." The housekeeper said, "What, in your rags?" The housekeeper said, "You clean up the kitchen, all the dishes, all the pots and pans, and you may fill your plate from the leftovers." Reisel filled a plate and went out to the courtyard and sat on the edge of the well. She noticed a beggar woman hobbling toward her, and she pushed her plate into the beggar woman's hand, saying, "You appear to be hungry. I believe you need this more than I do." And the beggar woman ate every morsel. And she put the plate down and she took Reisel's hands and she said, "Because of your kindness, you will have 3 wishes." But the magic ends at midnight, and suddenly the woman vanished. Reisel wondered, oh, could it be? And she closed her eyes and she said, "I wish for a Purim costume." And she felt different, and when she opened her eyes, she was dressed in the most beautiful Queen Esther costume she had ever seen. She twirled around happily, and then she closed her eyes again, and she wished, I wish for a wagon drawn by a horse. And when she opened her eyes, there was a wagon and a horse, and she climbed aboard the wagon, and she went to the town hall. As she entered the hall, every eye was upon her. She overheard someone say, "Oh, what a beautiful Queen Esther costume." And somebody else said, "I wonder where she got such a costume." The klezmer band began playing music, and the rabbi's son came up to her and said, "May I be so bold, but you are the loveliest Queen Esther I have ever seen. It's a shame that there are not going to be any prizes given away today for costumes." But Raisel was modest, and she said to him, "It is written, you must not admire the flask, but what it holds." The rabbi's son couldn't believe it. He said, "Where did you learn the words of the Talmud?" And she replied that her grandfather had taught her, and with tears in her eyes, she explained that he was a scholar. The rabbi's son said, "Well, could I have heard of him? Maybe studied under him?" And she said, "I doubt it. We were from a very small village." And the rabbi's son asked her, "And where do you live now?" She couldn't believe it. He did not realize that she was the rag girl that lived in his kitchen. And so she quickly made up a rhyme. "What's more precious than rubies, more lasting than gold? What can never be traded, borrowed, or sold? What comes with great effort and takes time, but then, once yours, will serve you again and again." Suddenly, the clock in the big hall chimed, and she realized it was almost midnight. She ran out of the hall, climbed into her wagon, sped through the streets of the village, and arrived at the door of the kitchen and noticed how dirty it was and said, "I wish the kitchen was clean," as the clock bonged its last bong. The kitchen was spotless, and there she stood again, once in her again in her rags. She lay down behind the stove and went to sleep. The next day, guests began arriving. She heard voices at the front of the house, and she turned and asked the housekeeper, "Are we having guests today?" The housekeeper said, "We? How dare you?" And she pushed Raisel into the food pantry and barred the door. There was only a tiny pinpoint of light coming through the door, and she followed it. She climbed up on a stool, and she was able to look through the crack in the door, down the hall, all the way to the dining room. And she saw the rabbi welcoming guests. And he said, "Last night, a girl asked my son a riddle. And my son thought that it showed extraordinary wisdom, and he now wants to marry that girl." Raisel thought, could it be her? Oh, one woman said, "I told you a riddle last night. Come hear my rhyme. Now what is that? Over my head and under my hat." And the rabbi's son said, "Well, that's your hair." And all the women in the room and many other women and girls came from the village and began asking him riddles. But he said, no, these are common. What I heard talked about something precious and lasting. And it was then that Raisel knew he was talking about her. And she began pounding on the door. And the rabbi's son heard it. And he came into the kitchen and he said, "What is that?" And the housekeeper said, "Oh, it's just the kitchen girl. She's cleaning out the pantry." And he said, "Unbar the door and let her out." And Raisel came out, and she immediately said to him, "What's more precious than rubies, more lasting than gold?" And he finished, "What can never be traded, borrowed, or sold? What comes with great effort and takes time, but then, once yours, will serve you again and again." And she said, "Yes." The rabbi's son said, "It is you. Will you marry me?" And Raisel said, "First, answer my riddle." And the rabbi's son said, "Learning." And Raisel said, "Yes, and yes, I will marry you." And they were married and lived and learned happily ever after. I'd like to thank the author of the picture book, Raisel's Riddle, Erica Silverman, for graciously allowing me and giving me permission to tell her story today. Thank you.